Chapter 9. At 9:30 Sunday morning, a private car transported Deirdre from Waikiki to Mauna Loa Bay for the private ash-scattering ceremony. Her parents' ashes had been encased together in a single pu'olu urn, and it was sitting on one of the benches in the canoe that an attendant helped Deirdre climb into. The pu'olu, a Hawaiian tea-leaf enclosure, would ensure there was no ash blowback from the wind, and it would protect the sea critters once the container was deposited into the ocean. A haku of white and yellow flowers bound the urn at the top. All in all, Deirdre thought the container was more elegant than an ordinary cardboard box. One of the attendants placed a basket of purple and yellow orchids at her feet in the canoe. 3 Polynesians accompanied Deirdre on the trip. All 3 wore sarongs. 2 of them were rowers, and the third, who was tattooed from head to foot, she guessed to be the minister. As they paddled out, he introduced himself as a chief and began explaining how the ceremony would proceed. Deirdre didn't pay much attention to him, though. She was busy staring at the pu'olu urn, painfully aware that her parents' ashes were inside, and once the container was dropped into the ocean, they would be forever out of her reach. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, she thought. What had made Deirdre think she was equipped to do this alone? Any second now, the dam of sorrow that had built up inside her was going to burst. When it did, she wasn't sure she'd recover. At 12:30 Sunday morning, a car took John, Amy, and Emily to Mamala Bay, where a boat was waiting to take them a half a mile or so offshore. After the pu'olu containing Jessica's ashes was lowered into the water, a short prayer was recited in a language that John, if he was being honest, didn't understand a word of. But there was a spiritual sentiment in the prayer giver's tone, one that made John feel like the guy was praying for Jessica's soul. John tossed the first handful of petals into the water. Then Amy and Emily followed his lead. He continued tossing petals into the water, and it felt like, with each handful, that Jessica was drifting farther and farther away from him. He didn't want to let go of her. He'd fought so hard against it that he'd held on to her ashes for 3 years. But it hadn't done any good. She was gone. She'd been gone. John reached for another handful of petals, but the basket was empty. Chapter 10. Back in his suite at Trump Tower, John stared at Jessica's letter sitting on the nightstand in his bedroom. He'd spread her ashes earlier in the day, but the letter was still there, waiting. He turned away from it to glance out the window. The street lamps outside had flickered on about a half an hour ago, and they cast a golden hue over the waves rolling lazily against the shore below. He thought of Jessica. She was out there now, in those waves, and she was gone, forever out of reach. John had to find a way to move on. He'd thought Deirdre might be his salvation. Being with her had chased away the sadness that had consumed his heart and filled it with joy. A part of him felt guilty about that, about getting close to another woman, about letting go of Jessica. The envelope encasing Jessica's letter goaded him. He looked back at it begrudgingly. Opening the letter would be like confessing to Jessica about Deirdre. How could he ever admit to her that he'd developed feelings for another woman? Before Hawaii, he hadn't wanted to open the letter because he was afraid that Jessica would implore him to remarry. That was the last thing he'd thought would ever happen, because he'd already given his whole heart to her, and there could never be anyone else. But now he had a different reason for not wanting to open the letter. What if Jessica's final words to him added to the guilt that had been festering inside him for the better part of a week now? But this thing with Deirdre was over. John had blown it with her, so really there was nothing to feel guilty about. He looked at the letter again for several seconds before he picked it up and broke the seal. The letter was dated 2 months before Jessica's death. My darling John, As I write this letter, I realize that I've accepted the fact that I am not going to win this battle. But you haven't. I'll be surprised if you're reading this 1 year after my death, as I requested. But I won't hold it against you if it takes a little longer. The thought of leaving you and the girls breaks my heart into pieces. This cancer thing is most certainly going to kill me, but it will never kill my love for you and our children. I don't want you or the girls to spend the rest of your lives mourning my death. I want you to carry on and live life to its fullest potential. John, my darling, please don't be afraid to fall in love again. You deserve to love and be loved. Our children deserve a mother figure in their lives. I want my children to have a mother after I'm gone. It may take a little time, but if you're willing, I know you can find someone who'll fill your and our children's hearts with joy. Someone who will love you as much as I do. Someone who will love my children as if they were her very own. Yesterday, I asked you to make a blind promise to me. Today, I'm going to tell you what you've promised. You've never broken a promise to me, and I don't expect you will start now. You must promise me that you will let your heart love again, and once you find her, you'll marry her. You must promise me that. When you find her, promise me that you will marry her. That is my fondest wish as I prepare to leave this earth, that you will honor my memory by living. My love, you deserve nothing less. Love always, Jessica. John refolded the letter and blew out a sigh, releasing the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His mind reeled as the reality settled in that Jessica was gone, and she wasn't coming back. Jessica had given him permission to move on, to live, even though she hadn't, and that stabbed at his already shattered heart. In a way, he had kind of moved on this week, and he was just beginning to realize that. But Deirdre was no longer an option. John had blown it with her. He never should have snapped at her. Now he realized, albeit too late, that Deirdre had been doing exactly what Jessica had wanted, and Deirdre could have been a wonderful mother to Amy and Emily. Now John had lost the only two women who'd ever meant anything to him. A soft rapping at the bedroom door dragged John out of his despair. Most likely it was Emily. Amy's knock was more forceful. "Yes?" he said. The door crept open, and Emily peeked in. "Can I come in?" she asked, almost helplessly. He pushed himself up against the headboard and crossed his legs, one over the other, on the bed. "Sure, honey." He patted the empty space beside him. "What's up?" he asked, as she climbed up to sit beside him. "Nothing on TV, or is Amy hogging the remote?" Realizing that was the most likely scenario, he chuckled a little. "No." Emily sniffed and rubbed her nose. The child was clearly hurting inside. Even a guy as clueless as John was at times could see that. Jessica was right. The girls needed a mother. John had tried to be both father and mother, but let's face it, he wasn't exactly equipped for it. But he knew enough to know that he had to get Emily to share her troubles with him. What would Jessica do? He questioned himself. She'd just come right out and ask her. Well, it was worth a shot. "Why are you so sad?" Even as he asked the question, he realized it had been a hard day for Emily, for all of them. "Are you missing Mommy today?" Emily nodded. "I miss Miss Deirdre, too," she admitted. "I know, honey." John draped an arm around Emily and hugged her. "You've grown quite fond of Miss Ferguson, haven't you?" Knowing that made John feel a bit guilty, since he'd been the one to chase her off. Emily nodded. "Did you and Miss Deirdre have a fight?" "Not exactly a fight, just a disagreement." "Could you go find her and tell her you're sorry?" "I tried. She doesn't want to hear it." Alarm flashed across Emily's eyes.
She doesn't like us anymore?"
"No, she likes you very much," John assured Emily. "It's me that she's unhappy with. Just me."
"I wanted her to come see us after we go home."
"Me too."
"Can't you go find your daddy?"
Emily was near tears now.
"Tell her how much we miss her."
She sucked in a breath, and it seemed to break the dam on the waterworks. Tears spilled over from her coffee-brown eyes.
"If you'll just tell her how much I miss her, maybe she'll come back."
John hugged Emily tighter.
"I'm sorry, baby. It has nothing to do with you. Miss Ferguson is angry at me, not you. She loves you very much."
Emily's pain, his own pain, Amy's rebellion, Jessica's death, Deirdre's rejection. The regret of it all swallowed him up. He didn't know how much more his heart could take. Deirdre had just settled comfortably on the bed and grabbed the remote to do a little channel surfing when her cell phone chimed. She picked it up off the nightstand. She hadn't heard from John. That is, he hadn't tried to call her since yesterday. Not a peep from him today. Part of her was glad about that, yet another part of her was sad. She longed to see him, to feel his touch, his kiss. She also missed the girls. They were such a delight. A couple of days ago she'd thought their lives might all become intertwined, but that was not meant to be, and that filled her heart with an ache that would never go away. That's why she'd been avoiding talking to John. The disappointment was too raw. Deirdre inspected the phone's display. "Lacey." "Okay, good." She accepted the call and tried to sound cheery when she said,
"Hello." "Deirdre!"
Lacey's overanimated voice poured through the phone.
"Why haven't you called? I've been dying to know what's going on." "I was going to call in a bit." "Are you coming home tomorrow?" she asked. "Or perhaps extending your stay?" She giggled impishly. "No, I'm coming home tomorrow." "Everything okay?"
Worry had invaded Lacey's tone.
"Everything's fine."
Deirdre tried to sound like that was true. She wasn't sure if she'd hit the mark.
"And John? Any plans to visit him?"
There was too much joy in Lacey's voice.
"When do I get to meet him?" "No,
Deirdre said, shaking her head.
"That's over." "Why? What happened?" "Well, to make a long story short, I sided with his daughter, and he didn't like it." "What do you mean you sided with his daughter?" "She wanted to get her hair streaked like mine. From out of nowhere, he turned into this controlling ass."
Deirdre shook her head and tried to tamp her anger back down into her gut. "When I mentioned that it was only hair, that it'd grow back, he went from control freak to asinine jerk. He basically told me to butt out, that his children were none of my business."
"Oh, my. Tell me about it. Just because his wife died and he has to be both mother and father now?" Lacey said. "That doesn't give him the right to bite your head off for offering a little well-meant, albeit unsolicited, advice."
That was the thing about Lacey. She could point out the other person's view while still maintaining support for the person she was talking to. But no matter how right Lacey was, it didn't change the fact that John had made it clear he would never allow her to be a mother to his children. And it wasn't like they had a mother to turn to. She was gone, long gone. The way Deirdre saw it, there was no future for her and John.
"Well, it's all a moot point now."
Deirdre shrugged.
"Why is that?"
It took Deirdre a moment to gather her thoughts so she could explain what the last week had done to her.
"Spending the last week with John and his children, being a confidant to the girls, being entrusted with their care, it changed me." "Okay, so clearly you became attached to his children, but what about him?"
Deirdre shook her head.
No, that's not what I mean.
She sucked in a breath.
It made me want to be in love and married and to be somebody's mother.
Oh. The word lingered on Lacey's tone like she'd just discovered some state secret.
So now all I have to do is find a man to fall in love with.
Deirdre laughed helplessly.
Next time I'd better pick one who wants the same thing. Next time. You know what I mean. You know what I think?
No, but Deirdre was sure she was about to find out.
What's that?
She asked, half afraid that Lacey's advice would involve Deirdre, in some form or fashion, crawling back to John.
You need to talk to John. Why, that bridge has burned. You need to tell him that you are sorry for butting in, that you only put yourself in the girl's shoes. Amy. Her name is Amy. Amy's shoes.
Lacey didn't let the interruption or correction disrupt her advice.
Because you care about her. And while you know that your advice was unsolicited, you couldn't help offering it because you can identify with Amy, as you know what it's like to lose one's mother.
Lacey was silent for a few seconds.
And then tell him again that you're sorry for butting in, and you'll try not to do it again. He wants something completely different than I do. What's the point in trying to repair the rift between us? You have to, Deirdre, Lacey said. If you don't part on good terms, I'm afraid this will ruin your ability to find someone else, someone who does want the same things as you. Deirdre, I want you to be happy.
Happy? Was it possible for Deirdre to find her happily ever after, like Lacey, Tasha, and Camille had? A couple of days ago she thought she'd found it. Today she feared her one and only chance had slipped through her fingers. Chapter 11. Deirdre made it to the Honolulu airport bright and early Monday morning to catch her flight back to the mainland. The sooner she left Hawaii, the better. But she wouldn't mind coming back. Oahu was beautiful, and she was curious about the other islands. Maybe she would return someday. Just not while John Sinclair was here. The announcement came for all first-class passengers to board, so Deirdre claimed a place in line. While she waited her turn, her cell phone chimed. She glanced at the display. Amy. Deirdre thought about letting it go to voicemail, but she couldn't be that cruel to the girl. She gave in to the urge to answer the call.
Hello.
Deirdre. It was John. Please don't hang up on me. I'm looking for Emily. Is she with you? Alarm rushed through Deirdre, and she forgot about the surprise that had enveloped her the second she heard his voice. No. Why would you think she's with me? She's gone. She was very upset last night. I thought she might have come to your hotel room. There was desperation in his voice, and it made Deirdre want to cry.
No, she didn't come to my hotel room before I checked out this morning.
You checked out? She nodded.
Yes, I'm returning to the mainland today.
I don't want to keep you. I was just hoping she was with you. That would have meant she was safe.
Safe?
He considered Deirdre to be a safe caregiver?
John, I'll be right there.
Deirdre stepped out of the line.
I'll phone you when I get back to Waikiki. Thank you.
Deirdre disconnected the call and headed for ground transportation. Her luggage was probably still at the hotel, as she used a service to ship it home so she didn't have to deal with it. She thought about postponing the shipment, but decided against it. She was only going to stay long enough to find Emily and make sure she was okay. If that rolled over into tomorrow, God forbid, well, there were plenty of shops where she could buy a dress or two. She flagged down a taxi and headed back to Waikiki. John Sinclair paced the covered entry of Trump Tower, waiting for the police to arrive. He and the staff had searched the hotel. He'd gone down to the beach, and then to the embassy suites. One of the bellhops thought he'd seen Emily earlier in the morning. A desk clerk confirmed it. Emily had been there asking about Deirdre. John could only surmise that Emily had left once they told her Deirdre had checked out. Where she could have gone next, John hadn't a clue. He had traversed Kalia between Saratoga and Lures, and then he ran up Lures and back down the beach walk. She wasn't there. She wasn't anywhere. Now all he could do was wait for the police and hope they'd find her unharmed. The taxi rolled to a stop in front of Trump Tower. An attendant opened the car door for Deirdre. She shoved some bills into the driver's hand and climbed out. The attendant's eyes lit with recognition. "Miss Ferguson," he said with a smile.
"I'm looking for Mr. Sinclair."
"He left about 10 minutes ago with the police." Deirdre's heart thumped against her chest.
"Have they found Emily?"
"Not yet." Deirdre glanced around, her eyes focusing on the nearby couch and chairs. She looked back at the attendant and pointed toward the furniture.
"I'll just wait here for Mr. Sinclair, then."
The young man nodded and turned away. Before Deirdre went to an empty chair, she glanced around. Her gaze settled on Fort DeRussy across the street, while her thoughts concentrated on Emily. Where was she? Where could she have disappeared to? Deirdre propped her hands on her hips. Where had Emily ran off to? How could she hide so effectively in a place where there were thousands of tourists milling around? Hide? Hide? Oh, my God! Deirdre ran down the driveway. She didn't wait for the traffic signals to turn in her favor. She simply darted across the street with horns blaring in her wake. Deirdre ran along the sidewalk between the Waikiki Shore Hotel and the beach side of Fort DeRussy Park. Thoughts of that day at the beach when she and Emily had built a sandcastle. Emily had shown Deirdre a glimpse of the playful world inside her imagination after they'd spotted the ship for the pirate adventure on its morning excursion. A momentary smile came to Deirdre as she recalled the fun they'd had, but it was quickly overshadowed by the fact that Emily was now missing, and Deirdre couldn't help feeling at least partly responsible. A flicker of hope fueled her to run faster. Could she be there, hiding in the shrubs behind the public restrooms? Deirdre followed the winding path that cut through the edge of the park. If she followed it toward the beach, she might be able to find a way through the shrubbery to see if Emily was crouched down there. If she was there, it was no wonder that John and the police hadn't been able to find her. With no cut-through path available to her, Deirdre pushed her way through 2 leafy plants, ignoring the stinging scratches to her legs. Once in the small path-like clearing between the shrubs and the building, she rushed around the corner toward the backside and found Emily on the ground, curled up against the shrubs. She appeared to be sleeping. Deirdre knelt at her side.
"Emily,"
she said softly, shaking her gently. Emily's eyes batted open.
"Miss Deirdre?"
she asked, as if she might be dreaming. She sat up, wrapped her arms around Deirdre, and started sobbing. Deirdre embraced Emily, overcome with joy that she was safe.
"Sweetie, don't cry."
She kept Emily hugged close with one arm and used her free hand to access her cell phone.
"I'm going to call your dad. He's very worried about you." "I went to your hotel this morning," Emily said between her sobbing. "They said you'd left."
"I did," she said, fiddling with her phone.
"But your daddy called me and told me he couldn't find you, so I came right back. I couldn't leave knowing you might be in danger."
Emily sat up and stared at Deirdre.
"Did I do something bad?"
"You shouldn't have run off like that without telling your dad. You scared us both."
"No, I mean,"
Emily shook her head,
"did I do something to make you not want to be around us anymore?"
Deirdre hugged Emily and fought the urge to cry.
"No, sweetie, it's just time for us all to go home, and unfortunately I live in a different place than you." "But my dad asked you to come see us," she said. "Will you?"
Deirdre found John's number and set the call.
"I would love to come see you,"
Deirdre told Emily, but she couldn't give the child false hope. How could she explain the hurdles of relationships to a 9-year-old?
It's complicated. That's what my dad said.
So true. Deirdre laughed a little, but only inside. Deirdre? John's voice poured from her phone.
Yes,
She couldn't get out the word found before John cut her off. Are you at the hotel? I'm with the police. We can't find her anywhere. He rattled away in a frantic tone.
John,
Deirdre said sharply.
I found her. She's down by the beach.
Oh, thank God. Is she okay? John muttered. Deirdre could hear the concern in his voice.
Yes, she's a little upset, but she's fine.
I'll be right there.
Look for us behind the public restrooms.
Deirdre disconnected the call and pulled Emily into her lap.
You gave us quite the scare, young lady.
But she said it in such a way that Emily would know Deirdre wasn't mad at her. Emily draped her arms around Deirdre's neck.
I didn't mean to scare you,
she said softly.
All is forgiven,
Deirdre said, hugging her close. They sat silently for what seemed only a few moments before John came charging through the shrubbery.
Emily!
Deirdre expected him to yank Emily away from her, and was surprised when he knelt down and enveloped both of them in his arms. An hour later, John stood on the lanai of his suite with Deirdre at his side. Emily had crashed a little while ago, and Amy was in the living area watching TV. He looked at Deirdre. Every so often, a gentle breeze would blow strands of her hair across her face, and she'd reach up and tug them back behind her ear.
I can't begin to tell you how thankful I am that you came back. Well, I couldn't leave while she was missing.
Thank you. He smiled, shook his head, and then threw his hands in the air.
I never would have found her. How did you know where to look for her?
Deirdre laughed.
That day on the beach, when we were building the sandcastle.
She shrugged.
We started playing this little game about pirates.
You were pirates? He asked, amused.
No.
She shook her head.
We had to find a place to hide the kingdom's treasure from the pirates.
I see. After much deliberation, we determined that between the shrubbery and the back of the restroom facility was the ideal place. Deirdre shrugged.
It was a lucky guess.
Well, I for one am grateful, John said. Deirdre had done exactly what Jessica would have done. She'd have gone out and found Emily. Deirdre was so in tune with Emily that she knew exactly where to find her, something John had failed miserably at. Deirdre's actions were that of a mother.
Do you think she's going to be okay now?
She'll survive, but there would be hell to pay until she got over it. Emily wanted something that just wasn't going to happen now that John had alienated Deirdre, but there was no use in reminding her of that. The last thing he wanted was to lay blame at Deirdre's feet. If anybody was to blame, it was him.
It breaks my heart to see her so upset,
Deirdre said softly. You are the hero here. John turned to her. More than anything, he wanted to pull Deirdre into his arms and kiss her, but he doubted she'd be as receptive now as she would have been a few days ago. I'm sorry we caused you to miss your flight.
Well, I'm sure that I can get another one tomorrow, maybe even tonight.
She was starting to look a little uncomfortable, and John didn't want that. He wanted her to feel at home with him and the girls. He wanted to believe there was still a chance. We're leaving this afternoon. Why don't you let us give you a ride back to the mainland?
Us?
It's a family jet.
Ah,
she said as she nodded. She didn't look surprised, but she didn't appear shocked either. The girls would, he said, astonished at how he was stumbling around the words. We would be delighted to have you accompany us on the flight. She nodded and said,
all right,
but the words came reluctantly.
What time should I meet you at the airport?
Why don't you just hang out here with us? We'll all go to the airport together. She appeared to be considering it, so John tried to tip the scales in his favor. I'm sure the girls would enjoy it. She needed a reason to stay, other than him. No matter how much he wanted it, he got the feeling she wasn't ready to forgive him. He was starting to doubt she ever would. But if there was the slightest chance he could make that happen, he'd find a way. Chapter 12. John dropped Deirdre off at LAX. When she disembarked from his private jet, he'd merely thanked her again for her help, gave her a sweet smile, and turned away. There were no declarations of, "I can't live without you," or anything like that, so Deirdre simply hailed a taxi and went home. She'd gone to see Lacey the next day. They'd had a grand time as Deirdre shared the details of her adventures with John and his children. But Lacey had grown tired and fallen asleep, so Deirdre left. Nearing her 6th month, carrying twins was beginning to take its toll on Lacey, Deirdre thought. Back at her house, about 3 blocks from Lacey's, Deirdre poured a glass of iced tea, dropped in a packet of Splenda, and headed out back to the patio beyond the pool, where she had a lovely view of the Pacific. After she sat down on her favorite lawn chair, she set her glass on the table and gazed out over the ocean. She'd always thought it was a gorgeous view, but now she realized that the Pacific wasn't nearly as engaging here as it was in Hawaii. "Spin it any way you want, Deirdre," she told herself softly. She knew the appeal hadn't been the tropical island so much as John and his children. She'd thought there might be something between them, her and John, but he'd kept his distance ever since the disagreement at the luau. Maybe she'd just been imagining their attraction. Maybe he was only up for a little island flirtation, but wasn't interested in any long-term commitments. Whatever the reason, Deirdre was in Southern California, while John and his children were in Northern Nevada, and she'd never felt so alone in her life. Not even right after her parents died. Now that she'd had a taste of what it was like to be someone's wife and someone's mother, she wanted it more than she'd ever wanted anything. Oh, she knew she and John had never even come close to moving in that direction, but there had been times in Hawaii when she'd felt it enough that she could almost touch it. Like the dinner cruise. The photographer had referred to Deirdre and John as Mom and Dad. Even though the photographer saying it didn't make it true, it had felt good. Deirdre now knew her life's dream was to be part of her very own family. She wanted to be someone's wife, and she needed to be someone's mother. John Sinclair questioned himself for the umpteenth time about what he was doing here as he strolled up the walkway to Deirdre Ferguson's home north of Malibu. His eyes pored over the attentively groomed grounds and brick-lined driveway. The house was grand and reminded him of a Tuscan villa. Taking all this in, John realized that Deirdre, or at least her family, had to have money. He stepped up to the door and rang the bell. After a few seconds, a man in his late 40s or early 50s opened the door. Was this Deirdre's father? No, she said her father was dead. Maybe an uncle. "Good afternoon," the man said. "May I help you, sir?" Instantly, John decided he was hired help. The house's owner would have simply looked at him and said, "Yes?" John said, "I'm looking for Deirdre Ferguson." "Is Miss Ferguson expecting you?" the guy asked. But John got the feeling he knew she wasn't. John shook his head. "No, I gave her a ride back to the mainland from Hawaii a couple of days ago. Could you tell her I'm here? My name is John Sinclair." The butler, John presumed, nodded as if he knew all about Deirdre's impromptu flight back home. "Would you care to wait in the living room?" "Sure, thanks," John said, stepping inside the entryway. John followed the butler across the foyer, in awe of the ornately laid tile floor that reminded him of a southwestern-styled rug. A rugged walnut table sat on one side of the hallway. It had 2 large candles atop it, and a matching mirror that was nearly the length of the table hanging on the wall above it. A large painting that looked like a garden patio overlooking the Mediterranean hung on the other side of the hall. The entryway opened up into a rustic living room where the butler left John and disappeared through a doorway off to the right.
John's eyes drifted around the room. There was a huge stone fireplace on the left that reminded him a lot of the fireplace in the main living room of his family home in Nevada. There was a brown leather couch facing a wall of windows that showcased a beautiful backyard filled with a variety of flora. He took a seat in the middle of the couch. It was, he suspected, made of the finest leather money could buy. He rubbed his palms together and realized his hands were sweating. He swabbed them over the legs of the Armani suit he was wearing. Upon hearing voices coming from another room, one of which he recognized as Deirdre's, John stood and fiddled with his tie. Deirdre walked in, wearing a colorful sleeveless blouse she'd probably gotten in Hawaii and a pair of tan shorts. John's heart leapt into his throat. She looked good. "Hi," was all he could say.
"Hi."
The word rolled off her tongue as she moved across the room toward him. She eyed him, waiting, as she sat down on the couch. John returned to the couch and looked at her.
"What are you doing here?"
she asked. Something flashed in her eyes. For a split second he thought she was happy to see him, but it faded so quickly that he thought he might have imagined it.
"I had to come see you,"
he said, then clasped his hands together.
"Look, I don't know what I did."
Well, that was not exactly accurate. John knew exactly what he'd done to bring about this rift between them. Since he'd decided to come here and pour his heart out to her, he'd better come clean. He shrugged and struggled to find the words.
"My behavior at the luau was deplorable."
She didn't disagree, nor did she speak. She just sat there looking at him like she wholeheartedly agreed. John shook his head, then shrugged.
"I led you to believe, hell, I believed it myself. I do want something more from you than friendship, and I'm sorry that I tried to stop you from being exactly what I wanted." "Let me ask you a question."
She got up and moved away from him to stand beside the wall of windows. The Pacific loomed in the distance behind the garden oasis. It was a beautiful sight, almost as beautiful as Deirdre.
She said, "How would Amy's mother have felt about her getting her hair streaked?"
John chuckled. "She would have taken her to the salon. Her words might not have been exactly the same as yours, but the sentiment would have been the same, that we cannot teach our daughter to let a man control her."
"Look, I care about Amy and Emily."
There it was again, that light in her eyes that suggested she was happy to see him.
"But I'm not trying to take their mother's place."
"I know." He stood and moved toward her. "But they certainly could benefit from having a mother figure in their lives, someone they trust, someone they can confide in."
"Don't you have plenty of sisters to fill that position?"
Deirdre crossed her arms in front of her as he moved closer to her. If she thought that was barrier enough to keep him away, she'd better think again. "Yes," he said, standing a foot or two from her. He followed her gaze, unwilling to relent until he'd commandeered her attention.
"But they're particularly fond of you."
She blushed a little. He stepped closer, just inches away. He could smell her perfume. It reminded him of flowers, roses, maybe. He breathed it in, letting it intoxicate him.
"You are not as charming as you think you are."
"Maybe not," he grinned. "But I'm getting to you."
"You think so, huh?"
Arms still folded in front of her, she moved back against the window, a smile tipping the corners of her mouth. He moved closer, still stalking her gaze like a tiger stalking his prey, and she was avoiding getting caught, just like a gazelle evading the tiger.
"I think that if I tried to kiss you right now, you'd let me."
"Give it your best shot, Tiger." John pulled her to him and kissed her long and hard and deep. Lacey de Laurent Matthews patted her bulging tummy and smiled.
"John Sinclair sounds like a dream."
Deirdre nodded.
"Yes, and roughly a 9-hour drive away."
Lacey shrugged. Flying takes a little over an hour. Deirdre shook her head. I can't fly back and forth to Reno every day. So move up there for a while. Get to know him. Find out if he's the one. Move up there? Deirdre couldn't believe Lacey was suggesting it. But I can't leave you now. We will be just fine. Nick will call you when I go into labor. Lacey sucked in a breath. Deirdre, I don't want you to miss out on your chance at happily ever after because you think you're beholden to stick close to me. She shook her head. I'm always going to be here, and if you do end up staying up there, I'm going to come see you a lot, and you're going to do the same. We will always be friends. Chapter 13. 3 months later. A meadow on the Sinclair property sloped down toward one of the larger fingers of Whisper Lake. It was one of the first places John had taken Deirdre while horseback riding after she rented a house in town. 5 miles, the distance from his family home to Whisper Falls, was definitely easier to travel than Southern California to northern Nevada. Today, Saturday, John and Deirdre had ridden the horses up to the lake for a picnic lunch, just like he'd promised her when they were in Hawaii. They were lounging together on a blanket not far from the shoreline. The horses had been tethered to a nearby shrub and were grazing on the meadow's grass. John and Deirdre had been nibbling on fruits and sandwiches and sipping wine from a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon. It was good to see him out of his suits and back into casual wear. It reminded her of Hawaii, even though his casual wear at home was Levi's and a t-shirt. But there was something to be said for his suits, too. John wore them well. Heck, he wore anything well. And she suspected he wore nothing at all, just as well. She felt the blush rising up her neck as he raked his fingers through her hair. He said, I've been thinking. Yeah? She said dreamily. I think you should take Amy into town to get her hair done. Deirdre sat up and looked at him. What? John nodded. If she still wants to get her hair done, I think you should take her. Really? Deirdre asked cautiously. The last time they'd talked about Amy's hair, it hadn't ended well. Things had been going so well, and she didn't want to spoil it. He nodded again. Besides, I'm sure she'll want it done before... His words trailed off. Before what? John flashed her a smile and sat up far enough to shove his hand into the front pocket of his Levi's. He came out with a little black velvet box. Deirdre's heart thudded against her chest. Could it be? No, things like this didn't happen to her. She sucked in a breath. He sat up on his knees and cracked open the box. Deirdre Ferguson, I know that I may not look like the ideal knight in shining armor because I come as a package deal. His words painted a portrait of his fear of rejection, but his eyes sparkled with hope. But my girls love you, and I love you. He cracked a little smile and turned the opened jewelry box to face her. And I would feel like the luckiest man on earth if you would consent to be my wife and the mother of my children, including Amy and Emily. Deirdre's heart swelled as she looked at the ring, a single emerald-cut diamond that had to be at least 5 or 6 carats, set in white gold, sparkled against the black velvet. Yes, she nodded. Her hands were shaking when he placed the ring on her finger, and she thought his might be shaking a little too. There, he said. Now I can breathe a little easier. He laughed at himself. And Amy and Emily are going to be thrilled. Deirdre threw her arms around him. I feel so lucky. John embraced her and began laughing cheerfully, happily. I love you so much, Deirdre. I love you too. Their lips met, sealing his proposal and her acceptance with a kiss. The voice of John's sister, Dana, echoed through the woods beyond the meadow. "John! Deirdre!" John pulled away from Deirdre, looked at her warily for a moment. "Over here!" Deirdre shouted. Dana trotted up on horseback, pulling on the reins a few feet from them. She said breathlessly, "Nick Matthews called." Nick had called John's house? Well, of course he had. There was no cell service up here in the meadow. "Lacey had the babies this morning, a boy and a girl." "Oh, my God!" Deirdre's hand flew to her chest. She'd missed it. She looked at John. He must have seen the uncertainty in her eyes and said, "Go to her." "Are you sure?" "Yes, she's your best friend, and she just gave birth to twins." "I wonder when I can get a flight out." "As soon as we can get you to the airport. A Sinclair jet will be waiting to take you to Southern California." Deirdre hated the thought of leaving John, and just as they'd gotten engaged, but needed, to go to her friend. And boy, did she have a story to tell Lacey, she realized, gazing at the colossal diamond on her finger. Deirdre looked up at John. "Do you think I could take Amy and Emily with me? It's summertime, so they won't be missing any school. I'd love for them to meet Lacey and Nick and the new babies. We'll only be gone a few days." John smiled, and his eyes watered a touch. "I think that's a fine idea. And you stay with Lacey as long as you feel you need to." John didn't accompany Deirdre and the girls to L.A., only to the airport. He thought it was important to let them go alone, so Deirdre would know that he trusted her with the girls, that he was willing to let her be their mother. After seeing them off, he returned home and went to find his father, who was out on the back deck overlooking the patch of pinyon pine at the far edge of the grass in the backyard. His father, Raymond Sr., who would turn 60 in the fall, had been spending a lot of time on the back deck lately, ever since he'd retired almost 3 years ago and turned the reins of Sinclair Enterprises over to John and his sister Lori. John had often suspected his father had done it to save him, John, from drowning in a pit of despair over Jessica's death. If that had been his father's intent, it had been a good call, because Sinclair Enterprises had given him something to focus on, something that he could control. John supposed that if Amy had something to focus on, something she could control, it would have helped her after losing her mother. John and his daughters had survived, and now they'd found Deirdre, and would be a whole family again, with Jessica's blessing. John sat down in the chair beside his father and gazed out over the yard and the pine trees in the distance. He did love this place, and wouldn't mind building a house for himself, Deirdre, and the girls, off to the left of the clearing. "So," his father spoke, "are you going to marry the girl?" "Yes, Father. Yes, I am." "I figured as much," he said. "That's why I asked her if she'd sign a prenup." His father went silent, but John could see him turning to face him. John looked at him. His father laughed. "You know what she said?" "She said she'd sign one if you would." John chuckled. That sounded about like Deirdre. "Why in the world would she want you to sign a prenup?" his father asked incredulously. "You don't know, do you?" "Know what?" "Come on, Father, don't play coy with me." John shook his head. "I know you had her checked out." "I did. I just don't have the reports back yet." "Well, let me clue you in." John leaned toward him, feeling a measure of pleasure at knowing something his father didn't, and said, "Deirdre is worth about $75 million. "Really?" His father's eyes grew wide. John shook his head. He knew that look all too well. "My fiancée's money is her own. I will not talk her into infusing it into Sinclair Enterprises. Besides, it wasn't like the Sinclairs needed it. They were one of the wealthiest families in the U.S., and Sinclair Enterprises reflected that." "Well, it was just a thought," Raymond Sr. said, slightly wounded. "Sinclair isn't hurting for cash, Dad." I know. He looked at John and nodded. But you can never have too much cash. Or too many grandchildren, John said. Right, Dad? Epilogue. A late summer wedding in northern Nevada suited Deirdre Ferguson just fine, especially since John Sinclair was the one waiting for her at the altar. A massive tent had been pitched out back between the house and the patch of pinyon pine trees. The ceremony and the reception would take place there, and afterwards John had promised her 2 weeks in Maui. He'd said their honeymoon could be any place she wanted. Maui was her first choice. She wanted to see more of Hawaii, the place that had brought them together. Lacey was painting Deirdre's fingernails and didn't look up when she said, "You look so happy. John's a keeper, not to mention a looker." She finished her declaration with a delightful giggle. "I did do well, didn't I?" Deirdre nodded and grinned. Lacey paused to look up at Deirdre and said, "Exceedingly. Your mom and dad would have been so thrilled to see you this happy. I'm sure they're smiling down on you right now." She smiled thoughtfully. Then she went back to painting Deirdre's nails. A soft knock echoed through the door. Then it opened enough for Laurie, John's older sister, to peek in. "Sorry to bug you, but I've got a note for you from John." Deirdre's heart skipped a beat. "I hope it's a good note," she said, waving Laurie inside. "Oh, I'm sure it is," she said, approaching Deirdre and offering her the petite envelope. Her eyes bounced between Deirdre's hands, one of which had wet nail polish. "Do you want me to take the note out of the envelope for you?" "Well, that'd be great, thanks." Deirdre tried to conquer the fear smoldering inside her that this might not be the lover's note Laurie believed it was. Laurie slipped the note from the envelope and opened it, but made it a point not to look at it as she handed it to Deirdre with a grin. Deirdre held her breath as she looked at John's handwriting. "Hurry up. I can hardly wait to call you my wife." This has been The Marriage Promise, Billionaire Games, Book 4, written by Sandra Edwards, narrated by Randy Fuller. Copyright 2014-2015 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards.